When I was a young doctor, actually during the training years, we worked either every night or almost every night. So we had this custom of getting together at midnight when the work was supposedly done and eating and drinking and telling amazing stories of what had happened during the day. Now, some of those stories were so remarkable that I've remembered them down through the years. And so I was able to use them in this book, The Soul of Medicine. In addition to that, I spoke to certain physicians that I've always admired for their probity, for their ability, everything about them. And I said, I want you to tell me the most interesting case you have ever had in all of your practice. And I chose individuals from different specialties. I suppose if I were to look for a common thread among those stories, I would say that it's the verisimilitude, the truth, the fact that these things actually happen. Most of what you see, obviously, on television is something some screenwriter wrote. That's not what this is. This is reality. These are the kinds of bizarre and twisted things that happen in hospitals all the time. The purpose of this book is storytelling. The purpose of this book is to capture the imagination of the general reader who has never worked in a hospital in a professional sense, and let them know that this can be remarkably interesting. You know, people ask me whether I've had one significant relationship with a patient that has impacted my views. My answer is very simple. Every single relationship I have had in the thousands over these years has changed something about my attitude toward the disease, toward disease in general, toward the patient, toward myself, toward my colleagues. Sometimes the change is microscopic, and I don't recognize it until 6 months later. But I know that every interaction with each patient has left me a different person than I was when I started. I chose the stories based on a number of criteria. One of the criteria was that this was such a fascinating story that it fascinated me. Another criterion was that the person who was telling it to me was also fascinated by it. So that I had this three-dimensional way of looking at this unusual, interesting story that I could count on people to want to read. I find that using the great medical historical figures as examples of what the human mind and the human body are capable of excites the students. And to me, anything that can excite the students is worth teaching. And they love medical history because they love to see where they came from, where our roots were, how we took essentially nothing and made a great science out of it, at least a clinical science, and now, of course, a laboratory science as well. One of the things that doctors do best for other doctors is to mentor them. When a young doctor is faced with an ethical difficulty, he should not face it alone. He should look for help. We all have certain people who are older than us that we identify with, that we have watched through crucial situations and watched them handle those situations well. One should never hesitate to ask for advice because in medicine, advice is freely given. One of the first things that doctors are taught in medical school is to observe keenly. Now, in theory, doctors are supposed to observe symptoms keenly and body parts keenly, but it washes over onto everything else. So I have spent all of these years from the day I graduated in 1955 until now keenly observing the behavior of my colleagues, the behavior of patients, the way things within hospitals have changed. So I put a lot of value in my observations and in my conclusions. There's not much question that the change in the medical profession, in medicine, that's had the greatest impact is this might surprise anyone who hears it, it's loss of trust in physicians. There was never any question until the 1960s. And you know, I was a doctor in the 1950s too, so I was through the 50s and the 60s and the 70s. There was never any question until that time of complete trust in physicians. But you recall what the uproar, what the tumult, what the turmoil of the 60s was like. Authority figures were scorned and made fun of. This happened with medicine as well. But medicine never recovered. And one of the reasons that medicine never recovered was that there was a particular change occurring in the specialty, in each of the specialties, but in the entire profession. And that had to do with the increase in the scientific content of medicine, with a concomitant decrease in the humanistic part of medicine. And I think what has always given people a sense of trust in their physicians is the feeling, the recognition that the physicians care about them, that everything they do is for the good of the patient. That has eroded over the years, and other things have changed along with it. For example, there's the sub-specialization. So if you're admitted to a hospital today, the chances are that you will not be taken care of by 1 or 2 or 3 doctors, but maybe 5 or 6, not feeling that any of them has your complete interest at heart. I think the greatest change in the doctor-patient relationship is that loss of complete trust. We have nowadays a very well-educated patient population. They're bombarded, whether it's from advertisements that they see on television, or whether it's from medical books, or whether it's from some serial on television, but they know a lot more than patients did 30 or 40 years ago. And they're a lot more demanding, and they question a lot more, and they demand a lot more consultations and a lot more certainty. The biggest obstacle for doctors coming into the profession today would probably be this tug between their personal lives and their professional lives. Doctors of my generation never had that problem. It was all professional life. You sacrificed so much of your personal life to your professional life. Things are different now. Doctors practice in groups. It's understood that in certain situations, doctors leave at a given time of day and they're not available. And some doctors feel conscience-stricken by that. I think that's the biggest problem for a young doctor to get himself organized with, so that he can avoid the pangs of his conscience when he's spending more time with his family. I'm a great believer in the unconscious mind, and once I get an idea in my head, I just let my unconscious flow free. But I do it with a pencil in my hand. I don't just let it go. As thoughts come to me, I am writing them. And what's fascinating about that is you end up with a complete narrative where the end of one sentence leads immediately into the beginning of the next sentence. Your unconscious mind is much better organized than you would ever dream it was if you try to record it. And that's what I'm doing. I'm only recording my unconscious thoughts as they come to the surface, and one thought leads to another, and the next thing I know, a chapter is finished, or a story is finished, or maybe even a book is finished. Every book I have ever written, I have written that way. It's a book I've wanted to write for a very long time, ever since I began writing. And there was always something in the way, something else I wanted to write about. To write a book of stories didn't seem as important to me, for example, as writing the biography of some medical pioneer. It didn't seem as important to me as writing about the human body and explaining it to the laity. It didn't seem certainly as important as writing about death and dying. Well, I've written a lot of books, and I've started to say to myself, you know, if I don't write that book of wonderful stories now, I'm never going to write it, so I'll do it now. And I had a glorious time doing it.